They say absolute power corrupts absolutely, but in the case of Caligula, it did something far more terrifying. It unleashed desires that stripped Rome of its dignity and left human lives crushed beneath the weight of one man's insanity. Imagine a city that once prided itself on law, order, and grandeur, forced instead to become a stage where cruelty was worshipped as entertainment and intimacy twisted into a theater of humiliation. His reign was not just political tyranny, was a desecration of human bodies, a perverse rewriting of what it meant to be Roman, and for many, it was a slow, unending nightmare. When Caligula ascended the throne in 37 CE, Rome was weary yet hopeful. The empire had endured bloodshed, betrayal, and cruelty under Tiberius, and the young emperor, nicknamed Caligula for the soldier's boots he wore as a boy, was at first a symbol of renewal. Crowds cheered him as a fresh dawn, a reminder that perhaps Rome could be governed with mercy and vision. But what the people did not know was that beneath the boyish smile and generous gifts lay a darkness that would soon make even Tiberius seem merciful. His mind, consumed by paranoia, unchecked lust, and a thirst for domination, would make sexuality into a weapon, intimacy into punishment, and pleasure into terror. What set Caligula apart was not just his cruelty, but the way he made it public. He believed Rome was his stage, and the bodies of men and women, noble or enslaved, freeborn or foreign, were his instruments of theater. He did not simply indulge in private debauchery, he performed it, forcing the city to witness acts that desecrated every sense of Roman virtue. Banquets would transform into orgies, where senators' wives were paraded like captives, summoned at the emperor's command to be taken before the eyes of their husbands, who sat frozen, humiliated, powerless. In a world where honor was everything, Caligula made honor his favorite victim. To understand the horror, you must imagine the silence of a Roman feast shattered not by laughter, but by the emperor's demand, "Bring her to me." The woman, trembling, would rise under the cold eyes of Rome's most powerful men, led to Caligula, as though she were a prisoner. There, before her husband and peers, she would be stripped of her dignity, reduced to an object of the emperor's fleeting desire. But it was not desire alone that drove him. It was domination, the pleasure of watching powerful men broken, forced to smile through humiliation, unable to defend the women they loved. In these moments, Rome itself was the victim. The city that prided itself on discipline, family honor, and the sanctity of tradition was reduced to a cruel stage. Senators, the supposed guardians of Rome's values, found themselves emasculated, powerless not just to protect their wives, but to resist their own destruction. And the women, often born into privilege and pride, were turned into living instruments of their husbands' humiliation. Pleasure was never the goal. The goal was fear so deep it silenced even whispers of resistance. Caligula's reign blurred every boundary. What was sacred, he defiled. What was intimate, he displayed. He turned family into fodder for scandal, casting suspicion on every bond. Ancient sources whisper that no one was safe from his desires, not even his sisters. He elevated Drusilla, the one he adored most, to a status almost divine, parading her as though she were not sister but consort. Whispers circulated of forbidden acts behind closed doors, of a man so intoxicated with power that the laws of gods and men no longer mattered. To the people of Rome, this was more than scandal, it was a desecration, a reminder that if even family ties could be violated, then no boundary remained, but the horror did not stop at nobles. Enslaved men and women already stripped of rights and dignity became the emperor's endless reservoir of victims. For them, resistance was impossible, for their very existence belonged to Rome, and Rome belonged to him. In Caligula's world, the line between body and property dissolved entirely. To be summoned by the emperor was not an honor, but a sentence and unspoken understanding that their suffering would feed his amusement. Stories tell of him taking pleasure not in the act itself, but in the look of despair, the knowledge that his victims could not say no, could not flee, could not speak of it after. Their silence was his music, their tears his entertainment. Yet Caligula was not content with secret cruelty. He demanded Rome see, Rome know, Rome tremble. He would turn banquets into theaters of sexual humiliation, but also temples into arenas of desecration. The sacred itself was not safe. There are accounts that he desecrated the temples of Rome by lying with women inside them, mocking the gods as powerless as men. To an ancient Roman, this was not merely indecency, was sacrilege, an assault on the very heart of their civilization. Every boundary Rome revered, Caligula shattered, until the city itself seemed cursed by his presence. But the most chilling aspect of Caligula's practices was not simply that they were monstrous. It was how they revealed the fragility of human dignity under tyranny. Rome was the greatest power in the known world. Yet its citizens, senators, soldiers, slaves, were all reduced to trembling subjects before the emperor's whims. His sexual practices were never about love, nor even lust. They were about domination. They were about proving that no one, no law, no god could restrain him. And in that domination, he destroyed the very fabric of what it meant to be Roman. What must it have been like to live under his reign? To sit at a banquet, knowing at any moment your wife could be summoned, your honor stripped before your eyes. To be enslaved, dreading the sound of footsteps in the night, for they might be coming for you. To worship at a temple, only to know that your God, too, had been mocked, his house defiled. Fear was everywhere, a constant shadow, and the human heart built for dignity, intimacy, and trust was crushed under the weight of shame. In the end, Caligula's practices remind us of something far larger than Rome: the terrifying ease with which power can corrupt, and the fragility of the human spirit when stripped of justice. His reign was not just a historical curiosity, it is a warning of what happens when pleasure becomes cruelty, when intimacy becomes a weapon, when dignity itself is turned into spectacle. Caligula may have died centuries ago, but the shadow of his terror still lingers in the story of every empire, every ruler, every human heart that forgets the sacredness of dignity. And yet, this is only the beginning. For the depths of Caligula's madness plunge further still, into acts so grotesque, so terrifying, that even Rome, so accustomed to brutality, whispered of them with trembling voices. His story does not end here. It only grows darker. The darkness of Caligula's reign deepened not gradually, but violently, as though each passing month stripped away another layer of humanity from the young emperor until nothing remained but madness clothed in royal robes. If his early indulgences humiliated Rome, what came next terrorized it. Caligula's appetite for control demanded escalation. What once shocked soon became routine. And so he sought newer ways to wield sexuality as punishment, as desecration, as a tool to break both bodies and spirits. Historians describe his cruelty with cautious words, for some acts were so extreme that even Rome, a city hardened by gladiatorial blood, whispered of them as though they were unfit for parchment. Caligula turned the palace itself into a brothel, a house of humiliation where noble women and men were forced into service. It is said that he commanded senators to offer their wives, daughters, and even sons for the emperor's pleasure, though pleasure was never the word, it was tribute, a currency of fear, a way of ensuring no man in Rome could claim dignity untouched by his hand. Imagine being a father, proud of your lineage, desperate to protect the honor of your family. And then comes the summons. Your daughter is to serve the emperor. To refuse would mean death. To accept would mean watching her reduced from citizen to captive in a single night. That was the cruelty of Caligula, forcing Rome to trade its most sacred bonds, family and dignity, for survival. Nor were these acts confined to Rome's elite. In the empire's vast machinery of enslavement, countless men and women were already treated as objects of labor and possession. Under Caligula, they became fuel for a darker theater. Enslaved bodies were summoned at whim, used and discarded like props in a spectacle only one man enjoyed. Some accounts tell of him staging acts in public, forcing enslaved men and women into degrading displays before the eyes of laughing courtiers, stripping intimacy of all meaning, reducing human connection to grotesque performance. To him, they were not people but shadows, and their silence only deepened his sense of godlike dominion. But even the gods themselves were not spared. Caligula's madness reached for the heavens, mocking not just mortals but divinity itself. He declared himself a living god, demanding worship, demanding sacrifice, and in some cases, desecrating the most sacred rituals with acts that horrified even Rome's hardened priests. In one infamous gesture, he is said to have built a brothel inside the sacred palace of the Vestal Virgins, an unthinkable violation of Rome's most revered guardians of chastity. To the Romans, this was not only blasphemy but catastrophe, for the Vestals symbolized the purity and survival of the empire. In corrupting them, Caligula mocked the very heartbeat of Rome, as if daring the gods to strike him down. What was the purpose of such desecration? To prove that he was untouchable, to show that no law divine or human could bind him. His sexual practices were no longer simply indulgence. They were declarations of absolute power, reminders that the body, the soul, even the sacred itself belonged to him. And the people, paralyzed by fear, watched their empire transformed into a kingdom of shame.